Hey guys, it's Flotz from Couple of Dabblers. Today's video is a demonstration of some cross-stitch starting and finishing methods that you might come across. Hopefully this video will help you. Enjoy! As you can see in the video, I'm using some scrap fabric from the UFO that I showed you in my cross-stitch collection video. I used the red marker to separate the fabric into different sections, and then I'm going to use them separately to show you different methods. So the first method I'm going to show you is a starting method. It is the classic loop method. You grab your needle and then you would have to grab a strand of thread. Make sure you fold the thread across so you have one end with a loop and the other end with two original ends of the thread. Then what you have to do is, with the side that has two end bits, you make sure you put that end into the hole of the needle. So you pull that end through, but make sure the end that has the loop is longer than the bit that has the two ends, if you know what I mean. After you do that, the first thing you do is you need to determine what the direction you need to start to complete your cross stitch. So what I normally do is I start from the bottom left and then go to the top right. So that's my first leg. And then the second leg would be the bottom right to top left. You can change the direction up depending on how you do your cross. It doesn't really matter in this case. So wherever you want to start, you would make sure the needle goes from the top to the bottom and starting from the first hole. So then what you get is a loop on top of the fabric. And then diagonally, you make sure the needle goes up towards you. Make sure you do not pull the thread all the way. You still keep that loop on top of the fabric. Then the needle would go through the loop. So that sort of creates an anchor. So after you do that, generally you would go back to the hole the needle just came up from. Unfortunately here I chose the other hole. It doesn't really matter. So after you pull the needle all the way through across to the other side of the fabric, then that's the thread anchored. So then you would just finish off the other leg as normal. And that completes a cross. As I've said, generally speaking, loop method is a golden method. It's probably one of the neatest starting methods you could use. So it is one of my favorite starting methods. It creates a very neat back. You could barely see it really from the back. So the good thing about it is it's easy once you get the hang of it. It's neat, as I've said, and it can be used on both Aida and linen or even weave. It can also be used on different stitches like normal cross stitch, back stitch, half stitch. As long as two holes, one line, you could use loop method to start off. The limitation will probably be because you need that classic loop for the needle to go through. So it can only be used when the pattern is calling for double strands, as in if the pattern's calling for 2 strands, 4 strands, 6 strands. If it's a single number, like 1 or 3, you would have to use some other methods. So the next method I want to introduce is a loop method as well, but it can be used with one strand of thread or single strand. You thread the needle differently this time. You just make sure one end goes through the hole of the needle, and then don't pull all the way across. So you leave one end shorter, one end longer. And then the needle goes through the fabric from the front to the back through a hole that you don't want to use yet. And you keep pulling until you can see a tail on the front of the fabric, and you need to hold on to the tail. You don't want the thread to go all the way to the other side. And then the needle goes from the back of the fabric to the front through the hole you want to start with. And I'm just showing you at this stage what the back of the fabric will look like. So then you go back to the hole where the needle came from, and that would create a loop. So then diagonally, your needle will go from the back to the front. So that's the hole you would make sure the thread go from back to front from. And then the needle goes through the loop you created just before. And then you go back to the diagonal hole. Make sure the thread goes from the front to the back. And that creates an anchor. And that's what the back looks like. So then you would stitch as normal. At this stage, you could already clip the tail off because now that thread is anchored. So the good thing about this method is it's neat at the back as well. Unfortunately, it takes a little bit more getting used to because the steps are a bit more complicated. Another good thing is now if the chart only calls for one strand, you could still have a loop method to start with. It can also be used on Aida, linen, even weave, all kinds of fabrics. Also, it can be used on backstitch, which generally calls for like one strand, and then half stitch, normal cross stitches as well. The next method is what I call the knot method. As the name suggests, you create a knot at the end of the thread after you've threaded the needle with only one end going through the hole. Here I am showing you how to do it when a pattern calls for 2 strands of thread, which is really just one strand folded over to create 2 strands. After the knot is done, you let the needle go through the hole you want to start with from the back to the front. Pull the thread all the way until the knot hits the hole. The knot should be the anchor you need. If you think the leftover thread after the knot is too long, you can clip it off, but make sure you keep the knot still, otherwise the stitch will be undone. Obviously, it is not the neatest method because you can clearly see the knot, but it is very easy and logical. It can be used with all fabrics, however, I do not recommend using it on very low fabric counts as the individual holes are bigger. That means for the knots to anchor, they need to be very bulky, which creates a very messy back. Plus, bigger knots create more chance for threads to hook onto them and cause problems when you stitch. 14 counts and above, however, should be fine for 2 strands of threads. The next method leaves a tail at the front. Thread the needle as normal with one end only going through the hole of the needle. This time the needle goes from the front to the back through a hole that is close to the hole you want to start with. Pull the thread through, but hold on to the tail at the front, then stitch as normal. What you will see at the back is a line between the tail hole and the hole your cross stitch actually started. For the thread to anchor, you just need to stitch in between so that the thread line at the back is naturally under some other stitches. After the thread is properly anchored, clip the tail from the front. Overall, this method is pretty easy, but it needs a bit of planning for non-full coverage pieces. You need to make sure there are other stitches in between your tail and your original starting point for the thread to be anchored properly. Also, as the tail at the front may need to be kept for a short while, your project might look messy for a bit of time before the tail gets clipped. The method also will waste a little bit of thread depending on how long your tail is and how much space you leave between your tail and your stitches. Because all manipulations are at the front, this method is great for people who cannot flip the pieces over to get access to the back of the fabric. So some people might use very big frames, so they prefer to do everything at the front, then they might like this method a lot. I'm also showing you here, instead of clipping the tail, you can stitch over it at the front. In this demonstration, I stitched over it with the same color of threads, so I'm not sure what it will look like if you stitch over the tail with other colors. This way, it's a bit more fiddly as you need to make sure the tail is completely under other stitches. I personally do not like this particular variation and have never used it in my own projects. Similarly, you can also start with the tail at the back. Thread the needle as normal, one end going through the hole of the needle. It is better if you can make sure the needle is in the midpoint of the strand of thread. Start from the hole you prefer, making the needle go from the back to the front through the hole. Then front to the back to the diagonal hole, leaving a tail at the back. This also completes the first leg of your cross stitch. As you're trying to do the top leg, with the needle coming back up from the back of to the front, it will create a loop at the back of the fabric. You need to make sure the tail is caught by the loop, as in it is under that loop. Then just keep on stitching. Check periodically, making sure that the tail is completely under other stitches. If you do not like the thread hanging, clip the excess off. The instruction included in many cross-stitch patterns or kits generally will demonstrate this method in the diagrams as a starting method. It is not hard for a beginner and looks pretty neat overall. However, it needs multiple stitches to anchor the thread properly, and it also needs access to the back of the fabric, so not suitable for people with very big and heavy frames. I call this method microstitch start. I personally use this method very often. This method was inspired by Cross Stitch with Luda. She had a video of her showing how she stitched with 3 strands of threads. My preferred way though is slightly different from hers but very similar. As I've mentioned, I normally start my bottom leg from the bottom left hole. So I leave a very short tail in the hole I will finish the cross stitch with. As you can see, my needle goes into the hole from the front to the back. Then it comes up in the middle of this Ada grid. I then go to the top right to create a micro stitch. Which then is covered with my normal bottom leg. Then you just finish this cross stitch off. The reason why I chose to leave that tail at that particular hole is that I knew I would finish the cross stitch off with the needle going into that hole from the front of the fabric to the back. This meant that I could use the needle to push that tiny tail to the back of the fabric, so the stitch from the front would look somewhat neat. Alternatively, you could leave a bigger tail, then clip it after you complete the cross stitch off. I like doing it this way because it saves threads, and I'm pretty stingy with threads. This method does not create the neatest stitches, but it doesn't look too bad. Also, all manipulations are done at the front of the fabric, so no need to access the back. This method works better with more than one strand, as then it creates enough coverage for the microstitch to be hidden. I've tried with one strand before and the microstitch definitely shows through. For the pin stitch method to work, we need to explain some traits of Ada fabrics first. As I'm showing you here, for each grid or square of the fabric, you have some weaves at the front, sometimes horizontal, sometimes vertical. Also, as a rule, from both left to right or top to bottom, it is always alternating between horizontal weave at the front to vertical weave at the front. Pin stitches are hidden in these weaves we're talking about. So depending on which grid you decide to pin stitch, it could go either horizontal or vertical direction. So in this demonstration, I've threaded my needle. I start from a hole in the grid close to where I want to start the pin stitch, with my needle going from the front through the hole to the back of the fabric, leaving a tail at the front. Then my needle comes up to split the front weave of this grid I want to start with. It doesn't matter how you split it really. I normally split from the side to the middle of the grid, then complete the other half. You could have your needle come up in the middle of the grid, then go through the fabric at one side, come up in the middle again, and then complete the other side. See, the stitch is pretty much enclosed within the front weave. Then the thread is anchored safely. You can just cross stitch over it as normal, then clip the tail off. The grid I first chose to start with had vertical weave at the front, so my pin stitch went vertically. If it is a horizontal weave at the front, you would do a horizontal pin stitch instead. This method ensures that all manipulations are done at the front of the project. Also, it doesn't cause too much wastage of the threads to be properly anchored. I do not personally use this method to start, but to finish instead, and we will elaborate on that soon. So here's the clip of me showing you what it would look like if the grid you choose to pin stitch on is a horizontal weave at the front. Hence, the pin stitch is done horizontally and the thread is hidden in that horizontal weave. So these are the starting methods I could think of. Now we can talk about finishing methods. Pretty much most of the starting methods can also be used as finishing methods, except for the loop methods. If you have enough existing stitches already, you can choose to finish at the back with the needle going under those stitches like so. Then pull the thread all the way and clip off the excess. I prefer my finishing to be under more stitches, normally 3 in one direction and 3 another direction, but generally speaking 3 or 4 stitches should be enough. You can also finish with the leftover thread at the front. After you finish with your last stitch with a thread, bring the thread to the front. Here I am demonstrating stitching over the tail at the front, hiding the tail completely under other stitches. You could also make your needle come up a few grids away from your last stitch, leave a tail, then make sure to stitch in between to secure the threads, then clip off the excess tail. Here I will show you my go-to finish method, pin stitch finish. I pin stitch next to or close to my last stitch, and the grid I decide to pin stitch has vertical weave at the front. So I split the weave vertically. And make my thread come to the front through a hole nearby. Then clip the excess off. As you can see, the finish is clearly visible, so you need to make sure where you decide to pin stitch it's charted to have something stitched on top. So now we come to the last method I want to talk about. This is for ninja stitch or a confetti stitch. I start with a classic loop stitch for the bottom leg, then do the top leg to complete the cross stitch. Now we need to anchor the stitch within this ninja stitch itself. So first you need to bring the thread to the front from one of the other holes. Then right next to the hole you just came up from, put the needle underneath both of the legs of this stitch. Pierce through the fabric, then pull the thread all the way. Do it again from another hole as in coming up to the front, then go down underneath the stitch itself, then come up again and clip the thread off. My stitch here doesn't look very neat, but everything is self-contained and you do not need to depend on other stitches to anchor the thread. And that brings the end of the video. I sincerely hope that the video was helpful because it wasn't the easiest to edit. Obviously there are way more methods out there and I really recommend you guys trying out things at least once to figure out which methods you prefer. Feel free to subscribe and turn on the notification bell to join me on this dabbling journey. But do keep in mind that Flosstube videos are not the only videos I make. Also feel free to leave me comments and we can start some healthy discussions. See you in other videos. Bye!